Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the first lecture in a series in which we'll be exploring the apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature, that is a name, or more specifically, a genre of literature that scholars working for dozens, hundreds of years have worked to refine and analyze and discuss. But it gives us, you might think about it as a bucket or a sorting basket that we can put similar types of literature into that bucket and call it apocalyptic literature. These are categories that to some degree are modern creations. To some degree they are the work of modern scholars. But to another degree, they represent or they reflect the sensibilities of early readers. So that early readers would have known that some of the texts that we identify as apocalyptic resonate or reflect or at least relate to some other texts, so that they would also put them together. Perhaps maybe not as closely as all of our Gospels in the New Testament, but certainly there would be some commonalities and some common feelings. And I think the reason that it's worth us spending about 6 weeks thinking about the apocalyptic literature is, one, it's a part of our Bible, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There is no getting away from apocalyptic literature. And the second reason is that I think apocalyptic literature is vastly misunderstood, or it's simply not engaged well, right? And so by studying it in our context, by exploring it in our context, perhaps it will feel a little less strange, a little less weird, if you will, and hopefully it'll help us to engage other parts of the Bible that are maybe interacting with or engaging with apocalyptic themes or ideas more effectively. So what I want to do in this video lecture is discuss the book of Daniel, and specifically the book of Daniel chapters 7 through 12, which are the more apocalyptic elements in the book of Daniel. Very often, Daniel as a whole is understood as the earliest or the only full apocalypse in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. But really, we get the sort of characteristics and the feel of apocalyptic more so from chapters 7 through 12 than we do from chapters 1 through 6. Previously in our class, we have read chapters 1 through 6, and you are more than welcome to reread those again. It's a pretty short book overall, but we're going to focus our analysis and our discussion on the apocalyptic literature, on the apocalyptic portion of Daniel. I want to start with a few reminders just about the book of Daniel as a whole and about these chapters or this section in Daniel specifically. The first thing to say is that Daniel is probably the latest writing in the Hebrew Bible in terms of chronology of when it was written. It's very likely that it was written sometime in the 3rd century BCE or possibly as late as the 2nd century BCE. And as is true with much of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, there are probably traditions and stories that are earlier than that, but it was probably written around that time period. So this is after the destruction of Jerusalem. This is after the Babylonian exile. This is after the return that was ushered in by Cyrus and the Persian Empire. And it is now moving into the era, the time period of Greek rule, known as the Hellenistic period. And that is an important point, as I'll say in a few minutes. The book of Daniel itself is kind of wonky. Part of it's written in Hebrew and part of it's written in Aramaic. The first 2 chapters or so are in Hebrew, And then the middle section, chapters 2 through 7, are in Aramaic. And then the end is in Hebrew again. And scholars have advanced all sorts of reasons and rationales for why this is the case. The break doesn't really reflect the thematic break in how the story is being told between chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 12. It is just a weird reality that it's a bilingual book. It's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. And so if we're thinking about these two major parts of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12, the first part is a narrative. It's a prose narrative about Daniel and his friends. And it's what I would call a court tale. It's a story about how these faithful and loyal Jewish persons can remain faithful and be successful in the court of a foreign king. That's the real sticking point there. In chapters 7 through 12, the narrative shifts. We go from a largely third-person narrative in chapters 1 through 6, he, she, or it, to a first-person narrative. Daniel, all of a sudden, speaks himself. It focuses on his internal experience and his own reception of these symbolic and powerful dreams. So it just has a very different feel to it, as I think you'll see when you engage it. The next thing that I would say, sort of by way of introduction, is some of the apocalyptic context, or why we would classify Daniel 7 through 12 as apocalyptic. And the first is a sort of historical data point, or even a political data point. And that is that Daniel, or at least this part of Daniel, is written in the shadow of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was a ruler who followed the Hellenistic period, followed the Greek period, and Antiochus created a number of policies in Jerusalem and in surrounding areas that were very anti-Jewish, or they were very hard on the Jewish people. They made it very hard for them to maintain their sense of purity or their sense of ritual food laws. And so Antiochus Epiphanes, in the Jewish imagination, is really kind of an ugly figure. And in many ways, much of the early apocalyptic literature is going to be wrestling with the policies and the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so when we read in chapters 7 through 12 about these rising and falling kingdoms and these blasphemous words of human rulers, it's very likely that Antiochus Epiphanes is the target of these discussions. The second thing I want to say about the sort of apocalyptic context of the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, concerns these visions. There are a number of visions that are captured in this part of the book of Daniel. In the first part of Daniel, the king receives visions and Daniel interprets them. But in this part, Daniel receives visions, and they're terrifying visions. They're weird visions. They include all sorts of animals and beasts and all those sorts of things. And what's interesting about these visions is, one, they're deeply symbolic. Animals symbolize something else. Kingdoms symbolize something else. The other thing that's really interesting about them, that's true of other apocalyptic literature, is that it requires an angelic interpreter. Daniel can receive these visions, but he doesn't understand them. He requires the assistance of an angel to unfold the deeper meaning of these visions. And so then in many ways, by recounting these visions and the interpretation, Daniel is giving access to an otherwise hidden reality. And the Greek word apocalypsis, from which we get apocalypse, is just that. It's just an unveiling. It's a revealing. It's a, sort of letting someone behind the curtain of reality. And so in many ways, the visions function to reveal. They function to uncover or unveil a hidden reality, often a hidden reality that is deeper or beyond the surface of what can be perceived and what can be seen visually or experienced in the present. The third thing about the apocalyptic context of this part of Daniel that I think is worth sort of highlighting, because we're going to see it again, is a technical term which is called ex eventu prophecy. Ex eventu prophecy. It means sort of after the event prophecy. It's a form, it's a literary feature that is putting forth present or recent historical realities as if they're going to occur in the future. And the way that Daniel does this is the book of Daniel, the narrative, puts Daniel and his associates in Babylon, in the Babylonian Empire, sometime in the 6th or 7th centuries BCE. So a long, long time ago. And these visions narrate realities from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, so the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, a 300 or a 400-year gap. And so there's this tension between the literary setting and access to and reality of these events that have happened in the more recent past. And so one of the things that characterizes ex eventu prophecy, at least in my experience, is that very often the way that history is unfolding in this prophetic or futuristic sense locates the present moment sort of right near the end, or right as bad as it could possibly get. That's when the seer is going to receive the vision. That's when the seer is going to sort of, that's the reality that they're addressing, is right before God's intervention, right when things get as bad as they could possibly be. That's sort of the climax of these prophetic utterances. The idea of ex eventu prophecy, it's not meant to say that these are somehow fictional or that these are dishonest in the ways that they're being told. Again, it's a literary device that emphasizes God's sovereignty, that emphasizes the hidden nature of this revelation, that emphasizes just sort of how sudden or unexpected it would be. But again, it's very often written from a point much, much later, when some of those historical realities that are hinted at in symbolic visions have actually taken place. And so it's written from that perspective of God always knew that this was going to happen. So now that we're finding ourselves as the recipients, the first readers of this writing, now that we find ourselves here, we know what to do. We know that God is in control. We know that God is going to save us and God is going to vindicate us. And that is a message of hope. It's a message of confidence in who God is and how God is going to work. As you read, I would really, really encourage you to read this from a solid study Bible, because the notes in the bottom are going to give you access to some of the ways in which scholars unpack the symbolic language or the symbolic meanings of these visions. Now, they could be wrong. Those are limited. They're human editors, just like all of us. But it'll give you a sense of how various scholars, are engaging these symbolic visions. So 3 questions as you read, or 3 things to pay attention to. The first is pay attention to power dynamics. How is power described? Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Who is grasping after more power? Who's giving power? Who's taking it away? Power is an important factor in Daniel and in other apocalyptic texts. The second is consider the character of Daniel the seer, the recipient of these visions, and especially consider the role that Daniel plays as it relates to the community that would have received and read Daniel in the first place. How does Daniel relate to these first hearers of the book? Is he a hero? Perhaps, or is he a model for what faithfulness looks like? Maybe. So pay attention to that relationship. And then finally, pay attention to the way in which these chapters give voice both to a profound sense of hurt or pain or alienation, and the ways in which they articulate hope. So how do they give us both lament and hope? How do they give us both grief and hope as you read? Well, friends, that is the end of my lecture on Daniel 7 through 12. We'll have other examples of apocalyptic literature, and what will be interesting is to see just the ways in which they relate to what we've just read in Daniel. We'll see some connections, we'll see some resonances and relationships. For now, happy reading.